Okay, it's happening. This is not a drill. They're finally doing it. Ringo's releasing a new country album. Oh, sorry, hang on, that's the wrong bit of news. Oh yeah, here we are. We're getting a Beatles biopic. Correction, we are getting 4 Beatles biopics, each from the perspective of a different Beatle, directed by Sam Mendes, and all coming out in 2027. I don't pretend to be an expert about many things, but my first YouTube video on this channel was a full breakdown of every single Beatles biopic. Like, if you tried to distill my weird YouTube channel into like branding, it would be the Beatles and biopics. So I feel like my opinion should carry some weight here. And by the way, this isn't some like unauthorized Nowhere Boy or Backbeat set before the lads were famous. This is a fully greenlit project with the blessings of the 2 surviving Beatles and the estates of Lennon and Harrison. This has never been achieved before. It has taken some 50 odd years for an official Beatles biopic project to be announced. Some thought it would never happen. Others thought it was only a matter of time. Where do I even begin to break down this news? I know that for as many people who are excited about this, there are just as many people who are extremely nervous about such an ambitious project. And most of us, like myself, are probably feeling a conflicted mix of those 2 emotions, excited and nervous. This is the biggest, most beloved band in the history of the world, and 4 official interconnected films telling their story will inevitably become part of that history, so there's a lot at stake here. In order to give the many thoughts in my head some structure, I'm going to break this video down into 5 parts. The current state of Beatles biopics, the problem with music biopics, why this Beatles biopic project might work, what I'm worried about, and then finally, my own idea for a Beatles biopic project. Whoa, not so fast, Beatles guy, okay? How are these cool, smart, and frankly very attractive people gonna know how to safely and securely browse the web without help from today's sponsor, NordVPN? Hi, I'm Man with Green Screen, and today I'm going to tell you everything you have to be scared about when using the internet. Unsecure public Wi-Fi. Phishing, only using 1 password. Trojan horses. You scared yet? You scared? Well, fear no more, because NordVPN is your best line of defense when using the internet. If you're using unstable public Wi-Fi, NordVPN will encrypt your online traffic at all times to keep those nasty hackers out. You can even block harmful websites right from the jump, or better yet, scan a file to see if it's infected with the Threat Protection tool. It's easy, you just jump into the security settings and then you toggle the Block Infected File switch. It's right there. What's great about NordVPN is that they allow up to 10 devices on one account. So whether you use this, or this, or this, you're all good, baby. And boy, do I have a great deal for you. Right now, you can get 4 months extra on a 2-year plan by going to the custom URL nordvpn.com/Elliot Roberts. You know, that other guy. And it's risk-free with Nord's 30-day money-back guarantee. I really recommend it. And I should know, I live in the internet. Hey, there's my house. Anyway, thanks Nord. Now back to that other guy. Okay, so beginning with part 1. So if you want the longer version of this, you can go and watch my video on Beatles biopics. I think it mostly holds up. But here is now the shorter version of where we're at with movies about the Beatles. From the late 70s through to the early 2010s, we've mainly been served up TV movies about the Beatles in some form, from their early years to John and Yoko, to John's early years, to John's later years. Well, it's a lot of John Lennon, in fact. This is also consistent with the 2 films that received theatrical releases, Nowhere Boy and Backbeat, which are both a lot more Lennon focused than the other 3 Beatles. We've never really been presented with a satisfying portrait of Paul McCartney, and every single film has treated George and Ringo like glorified featured extras, which is why we say justice for George and Ringo. Now, there have been some other Beatles related biopics announced. One of them is just waiting for a release date. What am I talking about? Well, in my Beatles biopic video, the first video on my channel, which I have to remind you is from September 2020, I mentioned the then recent announcement of a Brian Epstein biopic titled Midas Man. There's also a film that's going to be starting production next year about the Beatles manager Brian Epstein. Being nearly 4 years on from that announcement, you would have thought the film might have been out by now, but it's been through a kind of production hell, being delayed first because of the unpredictable nature of the pandemic, and then a further delay of more than a year between shoots as the film accounted for a total of 3 different directors before finally wrapping in June of last year. Pretty rough time over at the Midas Man camp, I think is kind of fair to say. There's been no word on a trailer or a release date, and the only photos that we've got from the production are those initial casting shots that doubled as a kind of a press release for the film that were released years ago. My guess is that it'll be released later this year. I mean, it's got to be. And I know it is just a Brian Epstein film. Epstein, whatever. It's not a full Beatles biopic, but man, I mean, talk about being overshadowed. Midas Man's gonna come out and people are gonna be like, oh, is this that Beatles Biopic project I've been hearing about? Someone's gonna have to be like, no, this is about their manager, and they'll go, yeah, I just think I'll wait for the Beatles Biopics. Sorry, Midas Man, this is not what you deserved. Or maybe it is. We'll see when it eventually comes out. Oh, and also, for the last couple of years, there's been these rumors going around about a John and Yoko biopic produced by Yoko Ono, but that's kind of all we've heard, just these early rumors. Yoko's getting on in years. I have no idea how this film has been progressing, but that's where we're at with Beatles biopics, folks. You're all caught up. So you can see that there's always been this big hole to fill for the Beatles biopic to come along where we don't just learn about their origins or their demise or try to psychoanalyze John Lennon, but one where we get a proper look at the Beatles, their relationships, their creative process, their story. And it looks like we're finally gonna get it, but is this necessarily a good thing? Let's explore that in part 2. A film or films about the lives of the Beatles sounds super entertaining, right? They're the most legendary band on earth. How has it even taken this long for a proper biopic about the Beatles to come out? Well, that may be because the music biopic genre rarely produces movies that are both box office successes and critically acclaimed films. So what are these major pitfalls that make the music biopic such a tricky genre to pull off? Well, in all my years analyzing these kinds of films, I've narrowed it down to 2 key issues. First is cramming too much in, aka the Wikipedia problem. This is perhaps the most common issue and is evident in many music biopics like Bohemian Rhapsody, Elvis, and countless others. It's where the writers of the film aim for breadth over depth and squeeze, say, 20 years worth of events into a 2-hour film. Often this will be done to allow for a dramatized celebration of an artist's life and their music, but can also end up reading a bit like a movie version of the artist's Wikipedia page. They're not really pinpointing a particular element of the subject's life to explore, but more showcasing how the life itself is storied enough and thrilling enough to work as a film in its own right. It's really what you see in those made-for-TV movie docudramas, but only this time you've got bigger budgets and the rights to the artist's songs. And I gotta say, audiences typically eat these kind of films up because they are, by their very nature, general in their execution. They don't ask too much from the viewer, and you kind of know what you're getting from one look at the poster. It's the movie about Bob Marley, it's the movie about Queen, it's the movie about Whitney Houston. And that's what it is. But that's all it really is. Not even Bradley Cooper, with the gorgeous cinematography of Maestro, could evade these claims about his own Leonard Bernstein biopic. The second major issue with music biopics is influence and bias. This is a problem that's actually pretty difficult to resolve because no matter how balanced the filmmakers will strive to make their movie, however fair and reasonable they're being with their choices, a film that depicts a real person's life will be seen as biased in some way or another. And this is a problem whether the film has the artist's blessing or not. Because technically speaking, you don't actually need permission from the real person, or in the case if they're deceased, their estate, to make a film about someone, but most do attempt to acquire that endorsement. It's kind of the respectful thing to do. In the case of Bohemian Rhapsody, the whole film was endorsed by the surviving members of Queen, with Brian May and Roger Taylor acting as consultants for the film. The influence of these two men, who wanted the film to be more family friendly and to obscure the more gritty R-rated elements of Freddie Mercury and the band's history.
Fabulous, isn't it? If you say so. Let's dance. Yes. I don't dance, Freddie.
Is seen by many as a hugely missed opportunity to tell a more compelling and revealing story about one of the most wild men in rock and roll. Influence in the right hands can also be a huge benefit to the film. For example, the egoless Brian Wilson was a massively helpful person to have on board the film Love and Mercy, who could verify facts and assist with accuracy, but stayed out of the way when it came to artistic license, allowing for an authentic but artistically satisfying film about 2 major periods of his life. Not having the artist or their estate on board usually means your film is dead on arrival. like with the film Stardust, the 2021 film about the early years of David Bowie. Which couldn't even use any of Bowie's music to tell its story and presented an extremely dull finished product. But to whatever extent they have someone's blessing, a film about someone famous will always be scrutinized to the highest degree. They didn't show Freddie Mercury's queer side enough in Bohemian Rhapsody, they didn't depict the racial tensions thoroughly enough in Elvis, the Bob Marley movie felt too sanitized. It is a very tricky balancing act. And sometimes it just gets really messy, like with the film Priscilla, which was obviously endorsed and worked on with Priscilla Presley, but her daughter, Lisa Marie, while she was still alive, was vocally not approving of that film by Sofia Coppola. Basically, with any biopic, someone's gonna feel like they're getting screwed. But can these 4 new Beatles biopics circumvent these major issues that are forever plaguing the genre? Well, I think they just may be able to. Here's what's giving me hope. So the 2 major issues plaguing music biopics of cramming too much in and artistic bias would 100% affect a single Beatles biopic. There's just absolutely no satisfying way of telling even a portion of the Beatles' incredible story in a 2 or even a 3-hour film. It would just feel like ticking off their greatest hits, like a mere cash grab for the filmmakers. I really would not like that. We would all deserve much better than that. And also for a film, any film, to work successfully on its own and not just act as a dramatized series of events, it requires a clear point of view, which is where the issue with artistic bias comes in. Like, even authors get accused of bias over one Beatle or another with the many books that have been written about the band. Even when they're trying to be impartial and 100% just stick to the facts, people always go, oh, they hated Paul, they favored John too much. You never hear the end of it. Plus, if you were to ask the 4 Beatles their recollection of the events of their history, you'd get 4 different responses. Which makes sense, right? George Harrison's experience of making Sgt. Pepper's Lonely Hearts Club Band, an album that featured only one of his songs, would be vastly different to Paul McCartney's memory of making this album, which was kind of his pet art pop project. Like, he loves that album. Ringo Starr's view of his time in India would be vastly different to how John Lennon experienced his time there. Paul McCartney's memory of 1965 would be vastly different from John and George, who had started taking LSD regularly from August of that year, whereas Paul didn't until the end of 1966. Like, it's important to remember that although when they played live they were nicknamed the 4-headed monster for how much of a singular unit they were, these were 4 individual men with completely different inner worlds. Particularly in the later years of their career, they had different ambitions, different drives, different, views of the world. And I think the director of these movies, Sam Mendes, must really understand this, as he's breaking up their story into 4 different films, each from a different Beatles perspective. And by the way, I just want to stress how unconventional this idea is. To my knowledge, nothing like this has ever been done before. Like, I know there's the whole Marvel Cinematic Universe, but even that was spread out over several years, not 4 films in 1 year, although it can feel like that sometimes. It is just very strange. 4 films, all telling a single story, and all being released in the same year. Very strange and very ambitious, but I love that the massive scope of the subject matter is being matched with an equally massive production undertaking. Like, this approach feels almost far-fetched, but it also feels earned. And as far as Sam Mendes goes as director, I really like his films. I thought 1917 was really cool. I loved how it was made to look like it was all this one shot, this war movie, this intimate war movie, all from this one person's perspective. Very cool take. His handling of the recent Bond films has been pretty excellent, I think. We'll wait and see, but his American Beauty, that's a good film. Anyway, it also means that we get 4 times the length to tell what is a very huge story, one that would be impossible to tell properly in a single film. And the bias or influence of one Beatle over another is kind of the point here. We want 4 different perspectives, and now each Beatle will get their own film. Finally. Justice for George and Ringo. What I wonder is how they're gonna break up the story between the films. You could do it chronologically with, like, John's film covering the early years, Ringo's covering the Beatlemania years, George is covering the psychedelic period, and Paul's depicting the breakdown of the band. But I have a feeling that's not what we're getting. I don't think that'd be wise. So I think all 4 films will show all different elements from every stage of the Beatles' journey, but the scenes chosen for each film will be specific to that Beatles experience. Like, for example, John's film may highlight the band's relationship to Brian Epstein, making the album Help. You often hear about that period through the lens of John's own insecurities, so that would make sense. It would also be fascinating to depict John's relationship to Paul versus how Paul sees his relationship with John in the McCartney film, where we'd probably also see for Paul like the making of Sgt. Pepper and, you know, the tragedy of the band falling apart. Maybe not. Maybe they'd go with, you know, completely unconventional approaches, and the film is already 2 steps ahead of me. I don't know. Like, would it be too obvious for George's film to cover a lot of their India trip? George's film might also cover the grueling tour schedule, which we know really impacted him the most. Oh man, when you think of all the possibilities, it really gets your mind racing. I also wonder about the span of years that these films will cover. Like, we've already had quite a lot on their formation, so perhaps the earliest events will be 1962, once the Beatles have already, you know, been a band for years, but they've yet to release their first album. And will we go beyond the band's breakup? Because in my opinion, some of the most fascinating elements of their lives happen after the Beatles cease operations as a group. From George's turbulent 1974 with his Dark Horse tour, or John and Paul's lyrical sparring over their 2 respective albums from 1971. What is the actual period these films are going to cover? If they're covering their absolute earliest beginnings, like, you know, 1957 as the Quarrymen are being formed, then they go all the way to the end of their time as a band, that will stretch well over 10 years. So will it all be the same group of actors even? Like, when George met John Lennon, he wasn't even at his fully grown height. The press release from Sony mentions, quote, "The dating cadence of the films, the details of which will be shared closer to the release, will be innovative and groundbreaking." Now, the term dating cadence is super vague and mysterious. I don't actually know if that refers to the dates that the films will be released in 2027, or if it means some kind of aging process to do with the casting or visual effects. Look, there's still a lot we don't know about this project, but according to one of the producers, Pippa Harris, I think there could be more reason to be excited than worried, as she told Deadline, quote, "What is truly exciting is for Sam to have the freedom to delve into the lives of each of the Beatles with nothing off limits and no sense of the band wanting him to tell a particular authorized version of their rise to success." That is very reassuring, because as much as my mind is filled with endless possibilities as to how great this film could be, or these films could be, I do also have my concerns, which I will share with you now. Something that I keep coming back to is the fact that this is the first Beatles biopic fully approved by Apple Corps, the Harrison estate, the Lennon estate, Ringo Starr, and most importantly, Paul McCartney. Paul McCartney has built up a bit of a reputation over the decades of keeping a very close eye around the Beatles brand, and why wouldn't he? It's his group, it's his music, and he wants to make sure the legacy of it is kept intact. Something that I'm sure Paul McCartney must have reckoned with is that at some point, whether he's alive or not, someone's going to want to make a Beatles biopic. So if you're Paul McCartney, you're probably thinking, do I block any attempt at a biopic while I'm alive because these things are often risky and I like to maintain control around the Beatles' legacy? Or is he thinking, well, once I'm dead, I'll have no say over any Beatles biopic, and this major part of this legacy that I hold dear will be left in other people's hands? This is what I think. That over the years, there have been many attempts from all different kinds of directors and writers who have conceptualized a Beatles biopic project and who have wanted the approval of the Beatles and their families. But I think it's taken till now that Paul is in these twilight years of his life, to finally be like, okay, I might not have a lot of time left. Now is the moment. And who knows, maybe no one's simply had as good of a pitch as Sam Mendes has had, but I just don't think we can discount the timing of this as a key factor here. So with that being said, is this a good thing? Or should we have actually waited until Ringo and Paul were no longer around to attempt something like this? Because I know it's implied that Sam Mendes will have total freedom, nothing's off limits, as it says, but it's just hard for me to imagine Paul McCartney just being like, go for it, I won't get in your way. Like, this is official, this is gonna be a big part of their legacy. I don't even know if this is something I'm actually worried about, because Paul and Ringo still being around, again, could also mean that they can, verify things, offer up previously secret or withheld anecdotes, demos, whatever it might be that will help make these films great. They're still with us as a tremendously helpful resource, and I'm gonna choose to decide that that is a good thing. Okay, but now, here are the things that I'm truly worried about. The first and major worry is casting. I said it way back in my Beatles biopic video that these 4 guys are some of the most beloved, most famous, most charismatic people who have ever lived. It is not going to be easy to find 4 dudes who can pull off this once-in-a-generation level of charm and magic that emanated from the Beatles. And it's not just about looks or nailing the voice, it's the chemistry with the other Beatles. That secret language that they all shared, but especially with John and Paul, that's just not something that you can learn in an acting class. It's something that comes from years of familiarity and bonding and sharing that same sense of humor as someone else. That's the part in every previous Beatles biopic, even the better ones, that I see so many actors struggle with. That spark that made the Beatles untouchable in press conferences, that ever so strange and hilarious quality you'd hear in their studio outtakes. That is the main casting hurdle here. Not whether the actor has John's nose or Paul's eyes. Like, everyone's getting bent out of shape about fan casts. It's not gonna matter, guys. Jacob Elordi's not playing Paul. Timothée Chalamet's not playing George. You've got to get 4 unknown guys. These dudes can't have anything else that we've seen them in my opinion. They should look like the Beatles, yes, but the main focus should be on finding guys capable of that authenticity, that palpable chemistry and humor between all 4 of them. That's the really important thing. If a dude doesn't look exactly like John Lennon, but he nails his wit, his ferociousness, his energy, once you've got that tangible spark between the 4 of them, that bubble that they're in, that it feels like no one else can penetrate, if they can nail that, looks just will not matter as much. Because with people like, Brian Wilson or Bob Marley, for example, people knew those guys, we can see videos of them online anytime we want and then scrutinize the actors' abilities of playing them. But the sheer level of exposure the Beatles have had on society is like nothing else. We really know what the Beatles were like across multiple generations. We all really know. And the thing that's made this even harder, Get Back. When The Beatles Get Back was released in 2021, it gave the world 9 additional hours of Beatles footage. And not just any footage of the band truly being themselves. Get Back has, more than any other piece of film or media, shown us what the Beatles were actually like. It was a revelation to see how they behaved around each other, how they spoke to each other, and also to other people. Millions of us have just had this 9-hour reminder of who the Beatles were and what they were like, and now you've got 4 actors who somehow have to match that level of familiarity. That is going to be an uphill battle. And even if you find the 4 most perfect guys who can somehow do all of that, the films could just as effectively be ruined by a bad script. Even if they have the chemistry, if the lines they're given are not up to snuff, then it won't matter how incredible the actors are. And that would be a huge waste. The scripts of these 4 films needs to obviously provide us with a unique and exciting take on their story, but it needs to really deeply know who these 4 guys were. The dialogue between the 4 Beatles is so crucial. I really do wonder who's going to be writing this. Is it a team of writers? Is it just one person? According to Deadline, they are, quote, locking down writers quickly. And look, I don't know the criteria for being on this team, but this is where I think I'd be the most helpful. But alas, I am but a mere YouTuber. I will not be asked to be a writer on this film. And I also won't be asked to audition for George Harrison, even though you all tell me I look like him so damn much. There's a bunch of other things I'm concerned about too. How will they use the music of the Beatles in an innovating way that truly shows how and why their studio creations were so revelatory? I don't want to see a scene of Ringo being like, I'm so tired, I've been working 8 days a week. Then all the rest of the Beatles look at each other and we smash cut to, get that out of here, we don't need that. These films need to transcend the biopic tropes. Every music biopic has become so goddamn predictable over the years that these 4 films need to provide a new way of telling the story of a person's life on film. Sam Mendes was quoted saying that he is excited to challenge the notion of what constitutes a trip to the movies, and I hope he means that in more ways than one. I don't want it to look flat and grey like every movie has looked the past few years, including music biopics. I don't want it to be sterile, I don't want it to be played safe, I don't want it to feel like any other music biopic I've ever seen. I want these movies to push boundaries, I want them to challenge audiences, I want these movies to do for cinema what the Beatles songs did for music. That's a tall ask, but that's just how I feel. Now, Over the years, I myself have wondered about how one could conceive of a Beatles biopic project. I've had a few ideas of my own, but I've always kept my cards close to my chest. But now that the wheels are in motion for another Beatles biopic project, the Beatles Biopic project, well, I'm sure it's safe to share some of my thoughts. So without any further ado, here's my big brain idea for a Beatles biopic series. Everyone says you gotta do it like The Crown. No, The Crown, as good as it is, or was, seasons 1 to 4, it's actually too many episodes. You don't need that much time taken on the Beatles' life, okay? We do need to be a bit more specific about what they actually meant, and a TV series, I think, would just get a bit too, like what are we doing here? Like, don't get me wrong, I would watch the most niche, 5 people know about this story version of an episode about the Beatles. I'd watch anything, but I don't think that would serve their story the best. Like, I'm serious about that. I would really watch anything. I would watch a 3-hour film that takes place during the night that the Beatles were stuck in Key West, Florida, and got really drunk and emotional and ended up saying how much they loved each other. I actually think that would make a great film. You could make an incredible film just about the night that John and George accidentally tried LSD for the first time off their dentist. You know, a film like that with a clear point of view would be, I just think, a richer experience than a TV series that tried to capture every moment of the Beatles just because a lot of things happened to them. So there's a director that inspired my concept for a Beatles biopic series, which was actually Richard Linklater, particularly his film Boyhood, where we witness a kid grow from early childhood into his late adolescence. The film was shot from 2002 to 2013 and released in 2014, and because of this unconventional approach, it was able to accurately depict the changes and growth of its cast, and it was kind of a revelation at the time. I've always thought how something similar could work beautifully with the story of the Beatles. You cast the same 4 actors but shoot 3 different films over the course of 10 years that span the key decade of the Beatles' career, with the first film covering 1960 to 1963, then 1964 to 1967, and finally 1968 to 1970, along with an epilogue. This method would solve a lot of problems that I believe plague most biopics, particularly music biopics. Firstly, the actors would be able to age gracefully, so you'd have actual young guys in their late teens and early 20s in the first film who are then approaching their 30s by the third film, resulting in authentic physical changes amongst the cast with no need for aging makeup or CGI. It would also allow the actors to grow or cut their hair for specific periods instead of a bunch of different wigs, which, as we've established over the years, really take me out of a biographical film, especially as no one can ever seem to get a Beatle wig right. And I know the Beatles didn't have like the same haircut for 3 years and then change it 3 years later, and then, I know films don't shoot in sequence, but this is like pie in the sky stuff here, okay? The first film would be shot on 16mm film on a 4:3 aspect ratio, perhaps even a portion of it in black and white to accentuate the look and feel of this era of not only the 60s, but this early stage of the Beatles' career. You could even record the sound in mono for full effect, which is an approach that the recent film The Holdovers took to bring out its own vintage aesthetic. This would help itself stand out from its 2 sequels, so you'd have the middle film then shot on 35mm film, and then the third film shot on 70mm film, and that would give each movie its own distinct visual flair. And I also think taking 3 years at a time is it's a good chunk to accurately tell a story like the Beatles on film. You could spend time not just on their upwards trajectory as a band, but on everything else happening around their success. John and Cynthia getting married and having Julian, George spending more time without the other Beatles in India, Paul getting into the avant-garde scene, etc. An alternate approach was inspired by a different film that I've actually covered on this channel, Steve Jobs, where instead of trying to cover every little aspect of the Beatles' career per film, you instead set each one before a different major event. So the first film would be set right before they're about to perform on the Ed Sullivan Show for the first time, and kickstart Beatlemania across the world, where we'd see the Beatles reflect on everything that's got them to this point in their career. Their early years as the Quarrymen, their stints in Hamburg, and their meteoric rise in Britain. We'd also see their ambition and their excitement for what the promise of America might bring, their idea of world fame, right as they're on the precipice of it themselves. That's the first film. Now the second film is set right before the Beatles play their final live show at Candlestick Park in 1966. So we're now checking in with a band who have lit the world on fire with their music and their films, but who are now yearning for something more. They've just released the album Revolver, which features a completely unique and forward-thinking sonic approach that is light years ahead of the live act they're now about to perform to a massive crowd of fans who can't even hear them. George is becoming interested in Indian music and Eastern philosophy. John's got a family. There's stuff happening. Now, the third film would be set right as they're about to embark on their final recorded album, Abbey Road, so it would take place right after the events of Get Back. We learn about how their last two efforts, the White Album and Get Back, of course not made into Let It Be yet, not to mention other projects like Magical Mystery Tour, the film that is, they've left them all feeling dissatisfied and distant from each other, and so they all agree to record an album built around their cohesive talents as opposed to their individual ones. That's the third film. I could keep going on forever about my ideas for a Beatles film that I'll never actually make. But suffice it to say, I'm very excited about these films coming in 2027. Right when I thought I was kind of done talking about biopics, this gets announced and well, I guess I've been pulled back in. But now I'd love to hear your thoughts on this Beatles biopic project. What have I missed? What should we all be concerned about that I didn't touch on in this video? What are we excited for? What are your ideas for how it could go, how the films could be split up? I'd really like to hear as many people, share their ideas on this as possible, because I'm very excited. Otherwise, I have a Patreon, which is where this video actually first premiered a little while back. If you'd like to see a bonus video from me every month, guaranteed video every month, you can get one on Patreon for a few dollars. You've also got my Discord on there. It's a real good time. So think about joining that, subscribe, like, all the things. And yeah, I'll see you guys soon for another video. All right, bye, Beatles Biopics. Woo, bye.